Russian leaders who lose wars think that things end up badly for them. He knows that. Putin knows that. He's put the whole weight of his presidency, his legacy, and his government behind achieving the subjugation of Ukraine. Now, he might think that he can cling on to those 4 occupied regions in the short term and then come back again in the future to complete the job. I think the Prigozhin affair showed the general weakness of the Russian state, how it's been completely consumed by war at all levels. So one thing after the invasions, the trajectory of things getting worse got even more worse more quickly. And you're seeing an attempt to indoctrinate the young, trying to change education program, changing official history. Everything is about war. War will be as long as it takes. The original goals have been forgotten, whatever they made up, what they are in the presidential administration today.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we're talking to the former UK Defence Attache to Moscow and Kyiv, John Foreman CBE, a Royal Navy veteran. He's had military diplomatic appointments in the US, with NATO and the EU, and served on global maritime operations. John Foreman, welcome to Frontline. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Kate.
You were UK Defence Attache to Moscow from 2019 to 2022. Can you tell me a little bit about your role and what it was like at that time?
Yes, well, thank you. I had very little notice I was going to Moscow. I had about 6 months. And when I got there, somebody told me it's a tough gig, and it turned out to be a tough gig for almost 3 years I was there. Obviously, relations are very difficult from 2018, the Skripal poisoning, so we lost a lot of people in the embassy, both Russian and UK diplomats. So there's a sense of sort of impending doom, I thought, especially into 2020. And there's a Russian website which says that each day, the day before, is worse than today's day, the worse the day before. And so it was turned out to be. We had rigged elections, rigged constitutions, we'd had poisoning of Alex Navalny, we'd had increasing rhetoric towards the West. We had then obviously the military build-up, first one in 2021, and then that obviously culminated in the war in 2022. And I think for us in the embassy, it was extremely difficult because Russia had closed off most of the links, the face-to-face links with the British side. And we were public enemy number one with a lot of the rhetoric coming out of the Russian government. I was summoned over the HMS Defender incident going through Crimean territorial waters in the summer of 21. But I think things accelerated from the middle of 21 into the invasion in 22. And then from 22 February onwards, it was much more a case of back keeping the lights on and the flag up, and then trying to understand what the Russians are up to in Ukraine.
So what did you do on a day-to-day basis? What was it like?
Well, it's obviously we had extensive surveillance of the Russian side, so it's not an easy place to be. We had obviously not great contacts within the Russian system, so we're always trying to work out who we can speak to, who would be a good interlocutor to give us insights into the Russian calculus. That's on the diplomatic side. On the military side, I'm also meeting other attaches in the diplomatic circuit and diplomats, trying to work out their perspectives, because I reckoned that our direct access to the Russians was difficult. Therefore, who were those people who had some form of access into the Russian system? Who should I go and speak to? Whether it's people from Central Asia, from Africa, Southern Asia, Far East, South America, seeing their perspectives as well, plus travelling around. I think travelling, getting out, talking to people. One person told me that being an attaché in Moscow, the most important thing is what does it feel like, what do people look like, what they smell like, what's their reaction to you, but not just in Moscow, but across the country. So we had also the COVID pandemic on top of that, so being a diplomat in that time was extremely difficult. But I think within those constraints, I managed to get out and form an opinion, because my job really is to provide advice, both to the ambassador and also to the Chief of Defence Staff.
And you set up a meeting for the UK Chief of Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, and the then Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, 2 weeks before the invasion of Ukraine. What were you hoping to achieve at the time? That meeting was Ben Wallace went to see Sergei Shoigu, the Defence Minister, and Tony Radakin went to the Chief of Staff, Valery Gerasimov. What were you trying to achieve?
Well, we'd already had some degree of contact with Gerasimov and Tony Radakin after Admiral Radakin became the Chief of Defence Staff. So we'd had a couple of phone calls, and the third one, this was a face-to-face meeting. It was Ben Wallace's idea. Mr. Wallace had invited Shoigu to London. Shoigu invited Wallace to Moscow. There's a bit of back and forth, and in the end, we decided Ben Wallace would come. And the thing was to talk to two senior interlocutors in the Russian system, the Defence Minister and the Chief of General Staff, both of whom we know on the National Security Council, and both within closer orbit of Mr. Putin, to set out the consequences of any Russian invasion of Ukraine. Because by that stage, the drums of war were very loud. We'd already had indications back from October, November that this was happening, and everything we'd seen in the subsequent months had been to justify our concerns. So by the time we got to the new year into February, it was really the last chance of the massive international effort to talk the Russians off and make this catastrophic strategic error by invading, and of course the consequences to Russia, Russian soldiers, their isolation, the economy, and that was the goal. So it was short and sharp. We didn't deal with pleasantries. We sat down and got straight into it. And we wanted them to say to us, are you going to invade Ukraine? Yes, no. And they said to our faces, no. So therefore, because we knew that was a lie, that then reiterated the importance of getting weapons to Ukraine to delay and disrupt the Russian invasion, which happened 2 weeks later.
So, coming away from those meetings, what was the thinking then?
It was that this is happening, and they're lying to our faces. And we had, the group sessions and the individual sessions. That was my idea. We wanted to be sat across the table 3 feet away, look these people in the eye, and say, "Are you going to do it?" And get past all the emotion.
Were you actually present at those meetings yourself?
I was the one with Radakin and Gerasimov. It was quite bullish. As I wrote for The Economist, he said to us, "I have now achieved conventional military parity with the United States," which was like a massive claim, which I knew was incorrect from my time working in America. So that sense of, we can do this. Shoigu was saying, you can't stop us. We're Russia, we're independent, we're strong. We face down the Nazis, all that sort of stuff. So I thought there was that degree of confidence that they could pull this off. And of course, they said they weren't planning to do it, which we knew was a lie, which just turned out to be a lie as well.
Did you ever meet President Putin yourself?
No, I think in a normal country, like when I was Defence Attache in Ukraine, or if you were normal, I met the President, I met the Prime Minister, I met the ministers, not just the defence ministers. By the time of my time in Moscow, nobody was really meeting Putin. Firstly, he saw himself above that. He didn't want to meet ambassadors. And secondly, he was very concerned about his own health through the pandemic. So he was closed off from contact with lots of other people, which I think contributed to his decision-making calculus in 2020 and 21, that he convinced himself this was his historic mission. So he wasn't meeting people, including me. I mean, the ambassador, she arrived to present her credentials, and normally, it's a big event, it's a one-on-one event, Defence Attache is there. Putin does all the ambassadors together. He does it from the other side of the room. He makes some sort of boilerplate speech about individual countries and leaves. So there was no real warmth rapport. I mean, we got him to speak to Boris Johnson before in sort of December time of 2021. He'd spoken before around COP26 in that year as well, but it wasn't really a warm and close relationship. So we would really talk to officials in the system rather than Putin himself.
With the benefit of hindsight, do you think that Russia was always on this path to invade Ukraine, or do you think it was a kind of strategy that changed depending on the circumstances?
Well, I think if you dial back to Putin's always been obsessed with Ukraine since his first days as the presidency. And a lot of Russians are obsessed about Ukraine, considering it's part of their historic lands, that it was taken from them unjustly as part of at the end of the Cold War. And Putin stewed in this juice of his loathing of Ukrainian independence for 20 years. He got involved in the first Ukrainian presidential elections. He was involved in the poisoning of President Yushchenko, I'm sure. He was going around Crimea when I was in Ukraine, showing himself to be sort of the great Russian leader. And then obviously things accelerated into the annexation of Crimea. So he put that into the context. I always thought it was in the back of his mind that there was some sort of once for all solving the final solution to the Ukraine question in his mind. That I will, it's my historic destiny to dismember the Ukrainian state, subjugate it, bring it back under our control. I think things accelerated in 2020. A Russian expert told me that he thought the planning started in summer of 2020, after Putin spent all that time alone with people dripping poison in his ear in his dacha during the pandemic. Things started to move into summer 2020, and then perhaps things accelerate in 2021, because when we saw the rehearsal or the first demonstration of build-up of force in the spring of 2021, that had obviously taken planning. So things had gone at least 3 months before that, so into the end of 2020. And I think it's just, I wrote at the end of my time in Moscow that I thought there was a multi-year strategy towards this. So rearmament had been completed, quote unquote. Navalny had been poisoned, the political opposition had been crushed, the journalism had been closed down, the preparations, the military operations had started. They built up a lot of money in their strategic funds, but all that together was, I think, indications that this was it. And as I pointed out to somebody else, I won the bottle of whiskey on the sweepstake of the date taken in November, because I always thought, if they're going to do it, this is when they're going to do it, in February. Unfortunately, I was right.
If we could talk a little bit about your time in Ukraine, we've seen the recent removal of the Defence Minister, Oleksiy Reznikov, replaced by Rustem Umerov. The ministry has been mired in corruption, scandal over people taking backhanders for cheap food, uniforms, paying to evade military service. Reznikov is not implicated in any of that, but when you served in Kyiv, how endemic was corruption then?
It was, it's absolutely terrible. So, again, defence in these countries is always attractive because the amount of money going through defence, food contracts and clothing, and also the ability to give rewards in return for promotions. But my friend of mine, a Ukrainian friend of mine, who's now still in the system, is an ambassador now, he told me at the time that he had nicknamed one of the defence ministers in Ukraine as the Minister of Corruption. His entire job was to scrape money out of the Ukraine defence system and pass it to his clients. That was his job, both his boss and elsewhere in the system. I know also at the time that traffic money for on-the-spot fines would be collected, taken into Kiev on a Friday, and then divided up and then sent back out. It's a massive money generation scheme. So 2014 comes along, and there's lots of promises about fighting anti-corruption. I think, looking at the sort of period after 2014 to 2022, there were efforts to fight corruption. But if you remember, before the invasion, there was mutterings that the West was dissatisfied with the progress being made by Zelensky and Poroshenko on corruption. And that institutions set up to fight corruption had been weakened to the expense of the nomenclature to take money. So that's the background. I mean, I know today Ukraine has a score of 33 out of 100 with Transparency International. The UK has got about 75 in comparison. It has improved. But I think the real point is, in wartime, you can't be seen to be fighting and having profiteers, and all the troops are dying on the front. And meanwhile, profiteers in Kiev and elsewhere are making money on the backs of dead Ukrainian soldiers. So I think Zelensky had to act. And he's also acted against a guy called Kolomoisky, another Ukrainian oligarch. So it remains to be seen whether the new defence minister will stamp down on corruption in the anticipation of development money coming from the West, both now and obviously once the war's finished.
Yeah, the new defence minister does have a reputation, doesn't he, for being very tough on corruption. It's one of his key challenges that President Zelensky has set out for him, along with strengthening the central role of the military in the defence sector, putting soldiers as the foremost value, expanding international partnerships, reforming the military to NATO standards. It sends out quite a strong signal, don't you think, where President Zelensky sees the future of his country?
I think so. Obviously, 18 months of war has changed everything. I don't think the Ukrainian people, 6 out of 10 say corruption is the number one problem that Ukraine has to sort out. And if that's the case, then Zelensky's come out for re-election. At some stage there'll be elections. The people in power need to address this problem. Otherwise, the problem of Ukrainian politics for 30 years has been this sort of backwards and forth. We have, Western leaners, and you have those who are more independent-minded, more Russian, quote-unquote, focused. It's never been able to set itself on a clear trajectory to where it wants to be, and corruption has eaten away. It's been a cancer throughout that process the last 30 odd years of Ukrainian independence. They have to address it if they want to meet their sort of what their stated destiny is, to be a member of the European family, both in NATO and the European Union.
The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Ukraine this week. He promised a new defence package, including a US Abrams tanks, Javelin missiles, depleted uranium rounds. Russia always seizes on that issue of depleted uranium to escalate its rhetoric. Is there any reality in the kind of things they're saying, that kind of rhetoric about that should not be supplied?
No, not at all. They've been using they use depleted uranium rounds already. They've been using against Ukrainians for 18 months. UK gave depleted uranium rounds with its Challenger, and the Russians made exactly the same point. The Russians made exactly the same thing about cluster munitions when the Russians have been using them against civilians in cities. So I think we have to look past the Russian bluster. It's a constant drumbeat of lies, unfortunately, which is picked up by those in the West who wants to say some sort of deal or put the blame on the West and Ukraine rather than the true blame, which is on Russia itself.
And the US has repeatedly said support will be given as long as it takes. You're among those who rail against that kind of statement for being too opaque. What is the it? What should it mean, do you think?
Well, I saw Mr. Blinken had been making, back to Mr. Blinken, in Kiev. He likes that phrase so much, he uses him and his team use it twice, as long as it takes. I mean, it's not a Marvel movie. I'd rather have some purpose to the it, to say, we're not just going to help Ukraine defend itself and deter future aggression, we're going to help Ukraine to defeat Russia. I'm speaking to Russian friends. They see the only hope for Russia is to be visibly defeated in Ukraine and change at home. And you won't have one without the other. And if we don't deal with the Russia problem, there will be no peace in Europe, long-standing. Putin can come back, or his successors. You have to break the cycle. And it's become a sort of, and it's not just me, I see people in America on all sides sort of calling out the administration's delays and lack of resolution. If you compare it to where we were in the 80s about facing down the Soviet Union, I would prefer to take the challenge head on. I think that also involves regime change being a policy rather than just sort of an aspiration. So I think that I would like to give Ukraine the arms to get the job done. I would like to see the sanctions tightened up. I would like to see the international tribunals on aggression and war crimes energized. I would like to see more work to try and isolate Russia, both from its allies in Africa as well. But I think we have to sort of set a vision, because if we don't, then the publics, Western publics, American and the UK, will start to wonder what it's all for. Why are we giving this money? Why do we have another difficult winter this year and maybe another one in 2 years' time? So that's what I want to see it to victory, rather than just sort of some sort of compromisey, messy peace deal, with more appeasement, which I'm not a great fan of.
When you say Ukraine get the job done, what does that mean, Ukraine looking like?
Well, I think obviously the offensive, I know you spoke to Mick Ryan this week, the offensive has to succeed. I want the Russians to be pushed out. At the moment, the Ukrainians believe they have disproportionate capabilities between themselves and the Russians. And there's been lots of delay about giving the Ukrainians the capabilities to meet that gap and to be able to really affect the battle space. And I also think it's, what is the goal? Is it just to go back to the February 22 borders, or is it to go back to the true 1991 borders? That's a different scale of effort. And I think, the strategy at the moment for the Americans seems to be to wait it out for Russia to sort of collapse and come to a realization that the war is going to needs to finish, and there has to be change at home. But I'm not convinced that's true. I think Putin's all in. I think we have to put our hand on the tiller or foot on the pedal a little bit just to try and drive the issue, rather than waiting for the Ukrainians to die until such time as change happens. And I think that there seems to be a drift ahead of the election next year, and I think we need to stay our principles rather than just talk about kit.
I mean, you could argue that the appointment of this new defence minister sends a strong signal. He's a Tatar who is from Crimea.
Yeah.
The intention, as far as Zelensky is concerned, is that they will keep on going until all of those territories are returned to Ukraine. Do you think that's necessary as well?
Well, I do. I think my goal has always been 1991. You have to stand by the principles of the United Nations Charter, and this is the current war is part of the previous occupation and the dirty war started in the Donbass, and the terrible crimes being visited on the people in Crimea and the occupied territories now. So there's a moral issue. So are we just going to abandon these people? I think that the sort of sense of drift, I mean, notwithstanding the huge amounts of kit, it's not just about equipment. It's about morality and willpower to see it as a proper challenge to our values, not just as how many rounds of ammunition we give us and how many drones. It's much more about the sort of world we want to live in the future.
The visit by the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, it's notable as the US has tried to keep senior military away from Ukraine, unlike the UK. How important are UK defence officials in communicating between Ukraine and NATO, do you think?
Well, I think that both Mr. Wallace and Admiral Radakin have been absolutely key in sort of being an early advocate for Western support to Ukraine in the really dark days of last February and subsequently. They both made numerous visits, and I saw the reporting, which I agree with, is that I think Admiral Radakin in particular has become a trusted interlocutor of the Ukrainian system, and his style is to take it back into those members of the alliance in NATO who are slightly less convinced about the approach to accept it out. So I think building consensus, showing leadership has been absolutely vital. I think back to your question, that's all been done under the previous defence minister. Absolutely critical to get into the new defence minister, meet quickly, and have Grant Shapps visit Ukraine to find out himself what the situation is. I know Mr. Shapps has been there before, but in his current role, he needs to go as defence minister, meet the new guy, and vice versa, get the defence minister from Ukraine to the UK will meet him to understand his needs and make sure it's factored into our process.
And the UK's Chief of Defence Staff is reported went with some of the most senior members of the armed forces from NATO countries to this secret council of war, as it's been described as, with Ukraine's Chief of the Military Commander, Valery Zaluzhny, in August. Do you know what might have gone on, or can you tell us what kind of thing might have gone on in that meeting?
I think the issue is, Admiral Radakin is a calm, considered and strategic leader. That's his modus operandi. That's why he became Chief of Defence Staff. So I think he would, as he's always done when I saw him in action, wants us to look beyond the current offensive, beyond which village is being liberated, looking into the winter, looking to 2024 and 2025, if we accept that this war isn't going to be over anytime soon. I think also it was to understand for himself, from his interlocutors who he's spent 18 months getting to know very well, what's the true nature of progress in the field, where are the Ukrainians against their own objectives, what support they need, when, how to unlock those defensive positions. I think there's also an important part of sort of strategic communications to the Russians to say, hey, I'm here, and I've got Sakya, General Cavoli here as well with the Ukrainians, arm in arm. Now we're with these guys. Don't think there's a split breaking between the West and the Ukrainian partners. Whatever briefings are coming out of Washington, where we're fully committed. There's two very, very senior officials. And I think also what you may be seeing after that meeting is now as a refocus on the southern axis in Ukraine. There was talk about Ukraine perhaps diverting its efforts in multiple places. Back to that disproportionate capabilities point. If you've got disproportionate capabilities against the Russians, don't spread your stuff too thinly. You have to try and concentrate force. But as General Zaluzhny said, it's Kursk, Battle of Kursk. It's not Iraq or Afghanistan, or it's more deep rather than World War II. So it's more a attritional battle. So I think Admiral Radakin would be very reluctant to lecture the Ukrainians on how to run a battle which the British haven't run since 1945.
Do you think there would have been some granular discussion, though, about tactics?
I think at that level, you're not into sort of here's a tactic. You're looking at the approach, the thinking. Okay, the tactical actions lead to operational success, which have strategic impact. So the offensive is an operation. It's a campaign at multiple levels in multiple venues, air, maritime, land, and in cyberspace. So I think if they're reviewing progress at that level, that's how I want to be used. Would you want to use the Chief Defence Staffs and Sakir, Scream Alike Mud Europe, rather than getting down into which trenches, whatever. So you'd hear those reports, but I think stepping back. I think then also what's the next phase? If they break through, which I think is possible but not probable, is then what happens next? So what does success look like in this season? What happens in the winter? What happens in spring? What do we need to do now to get the Ukrainians ready in the spring for the next phase?
I won't ask you to answer all of those questions right now. But you mentioned the maritime aspect of this war. With your Royal Navy hat on, can you give us an overview of how this war is being played out at sea and how that fits into the overall strategies of both the Ukrainians and the Russians?
Sure. Well, I think if you go back to February 22, the Russians have moved in assets from outside the Black Sea, especially amphibious shipping, and they've done a big rehearsal to demonstrate they could do this in Crimea. And I think the Russian naval approach was to support the army on its flanks, to contribute to the sort of missiles attacking Ukrainian cities and Ukrainian factories, key infrastructure, using Crimea naval aviation as an enabler to attack Ukraine. And they had some success, actually. If you think about the maritime campaign, the Russians sank most of the Ukrainian navy early on. And actually, if they had stayed like that, that would have been good for them. Unfortunately, they managed to lose now 10 ships of their own from Ukrainian counterattack, including the Moskva. So it's turned out to be their performance, the Russian Navy performance, Black Sea, has been pretty poor, I think, generally. So they had ambitions to use these amphibious ships to perhaps attack Odessa. But once Moskva was sunk, and once the Ukrainians used minefields, that was not possible. Most of the ships have then been withdrawn and sitting alongside where they can be attacked by Ukrainian drones. And I think from the Ukrainian side, once the Navy was largely destroyed, they had to shift their tactic. So their tactic is to deny Russia's use of the sea rather than control it themselves. That's why you're seeing these new technologies, long-range drones coming on a line. They're attacking the bridges. They've attacked shipping in Sevastopol. They've gone all the way to Novorossiysk, almost sunk an amphibious ship, despite the fact that the Russians know this stuff is coming. They're also now carrying out raids into Crimea and into occupied Ukrainian territory, targeting the Crimea air defences so the Ukrainians can get their drones back into action over Crimea. So I think if I look back at the whole thing, I think a lot of Russians have said, well, what's the Russian Navy actually for? It's hasn't got sea control of the Black Sea. It's sort of supporting the land campaign, sort of, but not particularly effectively. It seems to be more time focused on its own protection rather than actually taking the battle to the Ukrainians. And I think it also shows us what the Russian Navy is really like, which is a pretty defensive and to the junior partner in the whole system behind the Army of the Air Force, and hasn't covered itself in glory over the last 18 months.
Do you see any points of escalation at sea?
The Ukrainian Navy, the Russian Navy seems to be quite good at missiling cities and killing children, but not much good at other things. I think I would anticipate the Ukrainians, as they have next generations of these long-range attack drones coming on, which is an asymmetric approach to the loss of their own shipping. I can see other Russian shipping, civilian shipping, being targeted, especially the Russian grain exports, more attacks on ports, and actually ultimately denying the Russians any ability to conduct maritime operations in the Black Sea.
We were talking earlier about Putin and how he was influenced during lockdown, during COVID, with the poison being poured into his ear.
Yeah.
We know he's facing local elections very soon, and you mentioned the practice of rigging votes by Putin's regime. Do you think he might still be worried about what he will hear at the ballot?
That's quite a good question. A good question. I think elections in Russia aren't elections; they're legitimization rituals for the power. So you have elections which then reflect glory back on you. I remember when I was in Russia in elections in 2020. What was interesting wasn't actually the results known. It was places where people didn't vote or voted for alternative candidates. And of course, how they approach those elections and how they manage it by the presidential administration is critical, because they obviously want to use this to show that Putin is popular, and they've already set a target. He's going to get 81% in the parliament in the presidential elections next year, and his party will get whatever it's going to get. But I think Navalny has and his organisation have pointed out to Russians there is a way of expressing discontent with the system within those elections. I'm quite interested to work out the figures after those elections have happened about what were the levels of support, abstentionism, ballots being ruined. Because what the Russians have done, the government has actually made voting over a 3-day period now, and made it online. So physical traces of voting and ballots and things like that are less, and now it's all done online, which enables the Central Electoral Commission to just fiddle around with the figures to make the result of what it's going to be, what it needs to be by the presidential administration.
You mentioned Alexei Navalny, opposition politician, but then he's got a long prison sentence, hasn't he?
Well, unfortunately, part of that sort of creeping repression, which we saw in my time there. Obviously, Navalny, they wanted to murder Navalny, and when he wasn't murdered and he came back, they imprisoned him, and they're going to try and kill him over the long term. And the question is, why did not kill him now? Because they don't need to, because they can push him out of sight, out of mind. And unfortunately, the conditions of Russian prisons are terrible, and they're handing out huge sentences now to any form of dissent. So the guy called Mr. Kura-Muzar, whose birthday is today, he was given 25 years for completely trumped up charges. Other people are given 8, 15 years. Of course, that has the effect of dampening any dissent. Also, the punishment meted out to Mr. Boghossian for his treachery and disloyalty also sends a chilling effect. So, unfortunately, I think I read that the number of political prisoners in Moscow, in Russia now, is the highest it's been since the 1970s. And those numbers will be added to, because people are daily being added to a list of foreign agents or terrorists or illegal organisations, which gives the security services a chance to imprison them on more trumped up charges, on ridiculous posting or putting likes on social media. And you only have to do a few people, and the rest of the people will be deterred from doing it.
And just on the subject of voting, some ballots will also take place in occupied regions of Ukraine, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson. Can this lend any legitimacy to Putin's alleged annexation of parts of Ukraine?
No, not at all. I mean, I think look at Crimea. You can't have elections to the barrel of a gun. It's not free to vote. Elections, people who want to vote against the occupying powers will be deterred, because the ballot boxes have been delivered by people from the Electoral Commission and a soldier with a gun. So are you going to be brave enough to state your opposition to occupation? No, you're not. So like the referendum on annexation or Donbass becoming independent, whatever, everything's fixed. They have no legitimacy whatsoever, and they must be ignored.
There are reports this week that Kim Jong-un will be meeting, or maybe meeting, President Putin to talk about potential arms deal, North Korea supplying Russia. What do you think is behind that kind of announcement?
It's interesting. At the start of the war, there was a wag made the joke that Ukraine had lots of people and no equipment, and Russia had lots of equipment and no people. And what both sides have done is tried to fill that gap. So the Ukrainians got their equipment from the West and their own industry, and the Russians got more people to use the kit they had in stock. Of course, the Ukrainians have been actually decimating Russian equipment the last 18 months, so much so that the Russian state had to put a huge amount of efforts to try and get more bang for its buck out of its military-industrial complex. So President Medvedev was sent into the factories, the new leadership of the military-industrial complex, and they were promised unlimited cash, but with very strong measures, double shifts, triple shifts to get this stuff done. But that stuff that approach still doesn't meet the requirements of the Russian army. So there's been a big effort to go to Iran for drones and other equipment, now North Korea, Syria, to say, look, we need this equipment. What can we get from you, and what can we buy? So we saw this potential meeting of the Korean leader with Mr. Putin by the visit of Shoigu, Mr. Defence Minister Shoigu, and he went there a few weeks ago with his team, and also the head of the GRU was in the delegation as well. So I think what's interesting is a sign of desperation, really, to actually have to go to North Korea, a country which is, if you're Russian, is way beneath you, a minor state, to now be seen to kowtow to Mr. Kim Jong-un. So I think it's a sign again how much the war has hollowed out the Russian state.
And we were talking earlier about this kind of creeping power trajectory of President Putin. I know, and you've been putting the pieces of the jigsaw together. Where do you think it's going to go?
And I think, I've read a book recently by a modern Russian writer, who pointed out that Russian leaders who lose wars think that things end up badly for them. He knows that. Putin knows that. He's put the whole weight of his presidency, his legacy, and his government behind achieving the subjugation of Ukraine. Now, he might think that he can cling on to those 4 occupied regions in the short term and then come back again in the future to complete the job. I think the Prigozhin affair showed the general weakness of the Russian state, how it's been completely consumed by war at all levels. So one thing after the invasions, the trajectory of getting worse got even worse more quickly. And you're seeing an attempt to indoctrinate the young, trying to change education program, changing official history. Everything is about war. War will be as long as it takes. The original goals have been forgotten, whatever they made up, what they are in the presidential administration today. So where does it end? I think Putin thinks he can cling on. He can wait for something to turn up. And probably in the West, he reckons his approach will be to wait for the Western interest or events or elections or Ukraine's exhaustion becoming ever stronger, that there will be more pressure on a deal. Meanwhile, at home, I think unfortunate truth is he's in power. He has no opposition. There's nobody of any standing who'd come against him. Those people inside the system who may have moved against him would have been massively deterred by the fate of Prigozhin, which I think was part of the intent of that whole public nature of the assassination. So I think what it means is we're in this for the long term, that Russia remains a revanchist state, determined to reclaim what it sees as its lost lands. It wants to get the Americans out of Europe. It wants to change the security arrangements inside Europe since the Cold War. It wants to establish itself as an alternative pole to US, quote, the US-led world as an axis of autocracies, like in Africa or in China, whatever. The only hope is that the war became so disastrous that there are people inside the system who cut their losses and get rid of him. But even then, it's not necessarily going to be a quick fix. So I think we're into this for a generational challenge, and we have to address it appropriately.
And just finally, if you were the UK Defence Attache to Kyiv right now, what would you be doing?
If I was in Kiev today, I'd be building on the work of my friend, the current DA and the previous DA. I'd be ensuring we deliver exactly what we promise and holding London to account about we've got to get this stuff. I'm making sure I understood the Ukrainian need and feeding it back into London. I'll be working out with my own network of contacts and people with insight what my view of the Ukrainian offensive is. I'll be lobbying intensively to get Mr. Shaps out to Kiev quickly. And I'll be saying to London, there's no time to go wobbly here. This is serious. This remains our most significant challenge. And we've got to deal with the problem in front of us, not push it off into the hope that this will go away in the next 2 to 3 years.
John Foreman, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.